Welcome to the Dynamics of Everyday Life, where we demystify some tricky concepts and get to know ourselves a little bit better. Welcome back to the Dynamics of Everyday Life. I'm always extra happy when I can use a Bond reference as a title of an episode, and today is no exception. Unfortunately, that's as far as I can take the reference, as the tomorrow that is referred to in the Bond film is actually Jonathan Pryce's newspaper, and not the day after today. But let's not worry too much about that. James Bond is one of the least likely people to procrastinate, so that's as close as we're getting. We all know the feeling of procrastination. I'll do it tomorrow. That can wait until tomorrow. Or, I'll do it next week when I've completed X, Y or Z, and then it'll be much better. Thinking about procrastination just makes me think about my tax return. This is not my favourite job, or anywhere close, but I'm very lucky that my husband does this for me. However, even knowing that I have some help around this isn't enough for me to put off doing my accounts. His latest tactic to encourage me is to say that if I do my accounts, then we can work out how much of the money I've saved to pay for my tax bill I can keep for myself, once we've offset it against my costs. And I like the idea, I really do, but I've still not got there yet. However, suggest to me that I should be planning a trip to Paris and I'll be checking Eurostar times and options and hotel availability before you've even finished a sentence. There's something about procrastination that can make us feel uncomfortable, that there's something wrong with us if we procrastinate, almost as if we're lazy. But I just don't think that's true. I think back to the days of the pandemic, where it felt in certain moments as if time stood still, and for a split second we all slowed down, because we had to. Yet now that the pandemic seems a bit of a distant memory, we've all ramped our lives up again, and in some ways we've pushed more into our lives than we did before, as if we're trying to prove a point to ourselves. So it's not that we're lazy, we just prioritise things differently. Let's consider this from a psychodynamic angle. I'm thinking that we can view procrastination as some form of defensive behaviour. We're keeping something away from us. At the moment, I'm toying with the idea of it being a form of self-care. When we procrastinate, we're often stopping ourselves from doing something. Maybe we aren't putting ourselves out there for fear of criticism. Similar to many podcasters, I had the idea for my podcast a few years ago. One of my colleagues, and now a friend, said to me that I should bring my love of psychodynamics to a podcast. I dismissed it then, thinking, who on earth would want to listen to that? And then I had more conversations around the topic, and more people asked why I hadn't got a podcast. Here I could pick up my defence mechanism bingo card and mark off rationalisation, because I rationalised why I wasn't doing this. I came up with lots of reasons. I didn't have the time. Well, I've got weekends now that my children aren't spending every waking moment of them at children's parties. It was far too expensive. It's really not. There are so many low-cost options available to would-be podcasters. I don't know what I'm doing. I didn't back then, but I love learning and I'm incredibly proud that I've learnt how to edit and produce episodes and work out how to adapt artwork, etc. I'm not saying I didn't have any help in the start. I did, and I have some ongoing support, but there's an awful lot of this I do myself. There wasn't enough material. I really don't know what I was thinking here. There's over 125 years psychodynamic thinking for me to research and adapt to my topic. There's plenty to talk about. People wouldn't be interested. At one point I did think it was just going to be my best friend and my mum listening. But then I realised that I like my podcast, and if anyone else likes it, then that's a bonus. The thing that got me out of my procrastination was the thought of, if not now, when? And this was the voice that I realised that I had to listen to, more than the voice in my head that was trying to rationalise my excuses. Looking back on this now, I realised that I was also concerned about criticism and putting my head above the parapet. Would people criticise what I've done? Well, yes, they probably would. And that's okay. There's learning to be done. And also, I'm not for everyone. I'm not everyone's cup of tea. But I am some people's vodka martini. And that's the way that I would rather it be. We can tell ourselves that we're keeping ourselves safe, but in reality, are we? We might think on a conscious level that we're safe, but our unconscious processes can be going into overdrive. Particularly if we've got a deadline coming up for a project, then putting it off is only going to increase our stress levels. I did spend a lot of time telling myself that I would start a podcast tomorrow, and at times I believed it, but for many months it was just an idea. I'm also going to mark denial off the bingo card because I denied to myself for a long time that the podcast was important to me. I thought that it wasn't something I should be doing. I'm not quite sure where I got that idea from, but if I could deny to myself that I wanted to do it, then it didn't really matter that I was putting it off. We can also have a false sense of tomorrow, because tomorrow can be too close. I used to think that I would start my podcast when my daughter would leave home to go to university. This was a great timestamp in my mind. But if the loss of my beloved friend Steve has taught me anything, it's that we're never promised any length of time. So I was back to, if not now, when? In the same way that picking up our phones can give us a dopamine hit, and that can be a huge source of procrastination, I'll just check the tennis scores. Ooh, is Stan Wawrinka playing? We can also get a dopamine hit from completing something last minute. It feels a bit masochistic to get a dopamine hit this way, but there are some people who love the adrenaline rush of being up against a deadline and getting it done at the last minute. We've all heard the phrase, "Oh, I'm very lastminute.com." And by describing ourselves that way, it helps us feel better about a way of being that probably isn't very good for our health. I'd also bring in here the idea of the repetition compulsion. A quick reminder about the repetition compulsion, as we've not talked about it for a few episodes. Freud talks about the repetition compulsion as us repeating things that don't bring us pleasure, instead of remembering them, as this is easier for our minds to cope with. We repeat experiences to try and find a way to feel control over circumstances. We're trying to gain mastery over primal experiences that cause us pain. We put ourselves in familiar situations so that we feel safe and avoid anxiety. Our minds want to avoid anxiety at all costs, so we return to tried and tested ways of behaviour. Maybe it feels unsafe for us to do things in a timely manner because we've never done things that way before. Could we be missing something if we do something too quickly? Without us realising that the chances of us missing something are realistically much greater if we do it at the last minute. If I manage my time badly and end up doing my podcast scripts later than I wanted to do them, then I can pretty much guarantee that I'll think of something incredibly clever and witty to say after I've published the episode. Maybe we tell ourselves that this is the way we work best, that it's best not to mess around with tried and tested ways of doing things. But are we just stuck in a behavioural pattern? The last point that I want to bring in is the idea of whether we really actually want to do something or not. We can be grappling with all kinds of defensive behaviours or wrapped up in repetitive behaviour, or we could just really not want to do something, and we don't want to admit this to ourselves. This can also be tricky. The very act of procrastinating means that we can deny to ourselves that we don't actually want to do or want what it is we're putting off. We can tell ourselves that we'll get round to it, that we're just procrastinating, that we don't have the time right now. But perhaps the reality is that we just don't want it. This might save us from difficult conversations with ourselves and with other people, and from having to consider other options instead. My invitation for you this week is for you to consider where in your life you might be procrastinating and what your reasons might be for this. Give yourself some grace around this. We act defensively for very good reasons, because we feel the need to protect ourselves, and protecting ourselves can be essential. But is procrastination doing more harm than good? One of my supervisors once shared the concept of the waiting room with me. We can have lots of good ideas and projects, but we can't necessarily work on everything at once. So if we can't dedicate time to it right now, it can go in the waiting room. And then when we're ready to take something out of the waiting room, we can see what's in there and decide what is the next project. At times we can also have a good clear out of the waiting room, as there might be things in there that aren't relevant anymore, or that we can accept that we don't want to do. What we're doing is, instead of berating ourselves for procrastinating, we can see ourselves as being more efficient with our time. Are there things that you could be putting in your waiting room to give yourself a bit more psychological space? Looking at ourselves at this level can be challenging and unnerving as we develop our awareness, so I'd always encourage that you do this at your own speed. If you feel you need some extra help around this, then I've put together a PDF resource sheet, and you can find the link for this in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Dynamics of Everyday Life. Please hit the follow button for future episodes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Instagram at The Dynamics of Everyday Life or find me on LinkedIn at Julia Rogers. I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on dynamics. The Dynamics of Everyday Life is brought to you by Coaching 42 and the fabulous team at the Podcast Boutique.